Today, we're diving into 15 horrifying caving disasters, stories of adventure turned to tragedy, where explorers face nature's raw power and the ultimate test of survival. As always, viewer discretion is advised. On January 29, 2017, 33-year-old Gregory Wilhelm and 3 of his friends arrived at Waianapanapa State Park in Maui, Hawaii. The park was a natural wonder, known for its black sand beaches, lava tubes, and mysterious caves. Among the locals, one cave in particular carried a chilling legend. It was said to be the site of a tragic murder, where a princess was killed by her husband, and a secret passage hidden deep within had never been fully explored. This story captured Gregory's imagination. A man with a passion for nature and adventure, he was determined to uncover what others had only dared to speculate about. Gregory had always been drawn to exploration. As a boy, he spent hours hiking and camping, later founding an eco-friendly waste management company in California. His love of discovery and technology led him to connect with people who shared his enthusiasm for nature's hidden wonders, including cave diving. Though not a professional diver, Gregory's confidence and curiosity often pushed him to take risks, trusting his instincts over caution. That morning, Gregory and his friends planned for a casual day at the park. They explored the scenic beauty, soaked in the stunning views of the black sand beach, and swam in the shallow pools near the cave's entrance. But as they neared the foreboding opening of the Waianapanapa caves, Gregory's focus shifted. While his friends were content to relax, Gregory's curiosity drew him toward the darkness beyond the visible waters. The cave's entrance, surrounded by jagged rock formations, was tranquil at first glance. Yet warning signs dotted the area, cautioning visitors about dangerous currents, violent waves, and unpredictable water levels. Locals avoided venturing beyond the well-lit shallow pool, knowing that the deeper sections of the cave were treacherous. Gregory proposed an idea that immediately unsettled his group. "I want to check out the cave," he said, gesturing to the narrow entrance partially submerged in water. His friends were hesitant. The caves were marked by warning signs, cautioning visitors about rising water levels, strong currents, and the unpredictable nature of the cave system. The women in the group flatly refused, arguing it was too dangerous, but Gregory, undeterred, assured them it would only be a brief exploration. "I just want to look a little deeper," he said, sealing his phone in a Ziploc bag to use as a flashlight. Reluctantly, his male friend agreed to join him, while the 2 women stayed behind, visibly uneasy. As the men swam into the cave, the light from Gregory's phone pierced the initial darkness, revealing jagged walls and tight passageways. The sunlit pool at the cave's entrance quickly gave way to an oppressive, shadowy maze. The tunnel narrowed with each foot forward, forcing them to squeeze through sharp openings. Gregory, leading the way, seemed unfazed by the discomfort, his excitement outweighing any fear. His friend, however, was growing uneasy. The water was icy, the passage confining, and the air carried a stillness that felt suffocating. As they ventured further, the cave seemed alive. The water levels began to rise and fall unpredictably, a phenomenon caused by the cave's connection to the ocean tides. Then Gregory spotted it, a narrow tunnel branching off from the main passage. "This has to be it," he said in excitement. "The secret passage." His friend hesitated, warning that the water was getting higher and colder. But Gregory was undeterred. The tunnel was too tight for both to enter at once. Gregory insisted on going first, squeezing through with slow, deliberate movements. His friend waited just outside, nervously watching the water rise around him. Gregory emerged into a small chamber where the water levels seemed stable. But as he adjusted his position, tragedy struck. The Ziploc bag slipped from his hands and his phone plunged into the water. The cave plunged into complete darkness. Gregory shouted to his friend, explaining what had happened. His friend called back, but the roaring water distorted their voices, and panic began to set in. Gregory thrashed in the water, desperately trying to retrieve the phone. Without its light, he was disoriented, his sense of direction erased in the black void. Every movement felt futile. As if their situation wasn't dire enough, an even more harrowing danger loomed in the background. The water around them began to rise rapidly, caused by the cave's connection to the ocean tides. As the water level climbed, the air pockets in the chamber grew smaller. As he got completely submerged in water, communication with him completely stopped. Outside the passage, his friend faced his own terror. With no light, no communication with his friend, and the water rising, he decided to retreat, painstakingly navigating back through the narrow, jagged passage in the total darkness. Miraculously, he emerged into the open air and rushed to the women, who were already panicked by how long they had been gone. Realizing Gregory was trapped, his friend re-entered the cave, this time guided only by touch and sheer determination. He stumbled upon the phone, its flashlight faintly glowing underwater. With this small victory, he pressed forward, calling out for Gregory. But there was no response, only the oppressive silence of the cave. Defeated, he returned to the surface, where the group called emergency services. At 12:54 p.m., the Maui Fire Department arrived, bringing an A-1 helicopter to survey the area. However, it quickly became clear that a specialized dive team was needed to navigate the treacherous cave. By the time the rescue team arrived with advanced equipment and powerful lights, hours had passed. They carefully maneuvered through the cave's tunnels, knowing any wrong move could dislodge rocks or trap them further. At 5 p.m., divers found Gregory's body floating 75 feet from the entrance. He had drifted deeper into the cave, likely disoriented and overwhelmed by the rising water. Recovery was slow and painstaking, the tight tunnels making every movement a challenge. As Gregory's lifeless form was brought to the surface, his friends stood in stunned silence. The reality of the tragedy sank in, their grief immeasurable. On 10th January 2010, two friends were tested by the unforgiving nature of nature itself. Upper Millerton Lake Cave, a network of winding passages, narrow drops, and freezing waters. For Paul Martson, 55, and Eric Burke, 36, it was just another day exploring the rugged underworld. Equipped with wetsuits and years of experience, the two ventured deep into the cave system, navigating precarious rock formations and frigid streams. But no amount of preparation could anticipate the chain of events that would leave one of them trapped, helpless, and on the brink of disaster. The pair had spent about an hour chimneying through the cave's tighter passages, occasionally dipping into icy water. Their plan was simple: explore and then return to the entrance. But in caves, simplicity is a luxury. They navigated a series of ledges and water-filled passages, their wetsuits offering some protection from the cold, but little comfort in the damp, claustrophobic environment. Their route took them further than most had ventured, a section where the passage narrowed, and debris from previous rockfalls cluttered the floor. Ahead of them, the sound of trickling water drew Paul's attention. He moved toward it, spotting a small hole where the water appeared to collect. It was tight, but passable. Below, he could see a vertical drop into the darkness, a tight, 6-foot vertical drop, just wide enough for a person to slither through. Paul decided to descend for a quick look before heading back. "I'll take a look and head back," Paul said over his shoulder. He slid into the hole feet first, using his hands to steady himself. His legs dangled freely as he searched for footholds. There were none. A chockstone was wedged in the rock above the hole that could be used for support. Instinctively, he reached out to steady himself, grabbing the chockstone. As he shifted his weight, the rock moved. In an instant, it came loose, and then it fell, slamming into his right arm and pinning it against the side of the hole. The impact left his torso halfway through the opening, his legs dangling over an unseen drop below. The stone crashed downward, pinning Paul's right arm between itself and a larger boulder at the hole's edge. His torso was still wedged in the narrow shaft, with his legs dangling freely below. His left arm flailed in the empty space beneath him, grasping at nothing. Paul's voice cut through the silence. 15 feet above, Eric scrambled to reach his friend. The sight was grim. Paul's arm was crushed, his body awkwardly contorted in the narrow space. If the rock shifted further, Paul's weight could pull him down, and the consequences would be catastrophic. Eric firmly told him not to move. He examined the rock, testing its stability. But even the slightest shift sent fresh pain through Paul's arm. Paul remained composed, his voice steady despite the rising panic. The calm belied the reality. Without outside help, Paul had no hope of freeing himself. And in the isolation of this remote cave, help wasn't coming. Eric assessed the situation. The chockstone was too heavy to lift outright. Using smaller rocks as leverage, he chipped away at the edges, trying to reduce the weight pressing on Paul's arm. Eric decided to try shifting smaller rocks around the chockstone to create space. With careful, deliberate movements, he chipped away at the debris, all while keeping an eye on the massive rock pinning Paul. Each adjustment brought a fresh wave of tension. Paul's voice broke through the silence. "If this rock goes, I'm done." "Hold steady," Eric replied. His focus remained absolute. Over time, Paul managed to gain a foothold in a small crack below. It was a minimal improvement, but enough to take some weight off his trapped arm. This gave Eric the opportunity to adjust his position and focus on the chockstone itself. "I'm going to move it. When I do, pull yourself up," Eric instructed. Paul nodded, though the strain in his voice betrayed his fear. Eric braced himself, his feet wedged against the walls of the narrow passage. He grabbed the chockstone with both hands and pushed. The rock shifted slightly and Paul began to pull himself upward. Suddenly, the stone slipped. Without thinking, Eric lunged forward, grabbing Paul by the back of his wetsuit just as the rock gave way. The force nearly pulled Eric into the hole, but he planted his legs against the walls and held firm. The chockstone crashed into the darkness below, its sound reverberating through the cave. Eric strained against Paul's weight, his muscles trembling as he hauled him upward. Finally, with one last desperate pull, Paul's torso cleared the edge. He collapsed onto the narrow ledge, his chest heaving. Eric fell back, gasping for air. For a moment, neither spoke. The sound of dripping water was the only noise in the chamber. There was no time to celebrate. The danger wasn't over. Paul's arm was swollen and bruised, barely functional. Paul's strength was waning, and his swollen arm made climbing difficult. Eric took the lead, guiding Paul through the narrow passages. At one particularly tricky section, Paul faltered, his strength waning. Eric climbed above him, bracing himself on a ledge to offer a hand. The trek back to the cave's entrance felt endless. When they finally emerged into the fading light of dusk, the relief was overwhelming. They were alive, but the experience had left them shaken. In the unforgiving environment of Upper Millerton Lake Cave, survival often comes down to a mixture of skill, determination, and luck. On this day, all three were tested, and just barely enough. Ellisons Cave in Georgia is a vertical caver's dream, a maze of plunging drops and hidden passageways. Among its features is Incredible Pit, a 440-foot vertical drop that attracts skilled adventurers from around the country. But on 10th March 1999, 28-year-old Harold Allen Bufford, known to friends as Hal, the cave became a deadly trap. Hal entered the cave on Tuesday morning with two companions, Chris Andrews and Anthony Bates. The trio were experienced cavers and had planned their descent into Incredible Pit carefully, or so they thought. After navigating the cave's stair-step entrance and its two initial pits, 80 and 83 feet deep, they reached the lip of Incredible Pit, where the real challenge began. Incredible Pit is not just a vertical drop. A sizable stream flows into the pit, creating a waterfall that cascades relentlessly for its entire length. The roar of the water is deafening, the spray constant, and the chill inescapable. Two ropes dangled side by side into the void. One, a 1/2-inch rope, had been left by a previous group. The second was a 7/16-inch rope the trio had rigged themselves. Descending the pit was grueling, but uneventful. Each caver carefully worked their way down, braving the freezing water that battered them the entire way. At the bottom, they explored the cavern's passages, marveling at the otherworldly formations carved by centuries of water flow. Late that evening, it was time to ascend. Climbing out of a pit as massive as Incredible Pit is physically demanding and mentally taxing. Chris climbed first, followed by Anthony. Both men emerged at the top, soaked and exhausted, but relieved to be on solid ground again. Hal was last to climb. By the time he began his ascent, it was nearly 11:30 p.m. The noise from the waterfall made communication difficult, so Chris and Anthony could only watch as Hal's headlamp began its slow journey upward. The rhythm of his movements seemed steady, reassuring his companions that he was making good progress. But around midnight, something went wrong. From above, Chris and Anthony caught faint, muffled cries. It took them a moment to understand that the voice was Hal's. The sound barely pierced through the relentless roar of the waterfall. Chris leaned over the edge, straining his eyes to see through the mist swirling below. In the dim, erratic light, he spotted Hal dangling precariously on the rope, his body swaying and his movements frantic. Hal was gesturing wildly, clearly panicking, his mouth opening and closing as he shouted for help. Though the words were swallowed by the deafening cascade, Anthony moved closer. The sight below sent a wave of dread through both men. Hal's movements were erratic, his attempts to adjust his position on the rope increasingly desperate. It was clear he was in trouble, struggling against both his gear and the icy onslaught of the waterfall. The two knew descending Incredible Pit again wasn't an option. The rope, already under immense strain from Hal's weight, was dangerous to use. A secondary accident could turn an already dire situation into a catastrophe. As Hal continued to flail and shout, the realization of their helplessness settled heavily on them. With no other choice, they turned back toward the surface, each step filled with the crushing urgency of finding help. Hal was approximately 150 feet up the 440-foot rope when he encountered this critical problem. His ropes had become tangled, an issue common when two ropes are rigged close together in a deep pit. To make matters worse, Hal was climbing the 1/2-inch rope using ascenders designed for smaller diameters. The friction slowed his progress and complicated his movements. Freezing and fatigued, Hal decided to switch from climbing to rappelling, a complex maneuver requiring precision. But something went horribly wrong. Both his ascenders were under tension, one on each rope. His rappel rack had been partially rigged, but wasn't functional. Hal was stuck, unable to ascend or descend. The waterfall pummeled him relentlessly, soaking his inadequate clothing. Unlike his companions who wore wetsuits, Hal was dressed in a plastic rain suit over denim overalls and a cotton thermal shirt. Cotton, infamous for its inability to insulate when wet, clung to his skin, rapidly leaching away his body heat. Time was running out. Hal Buffer dangled 150 feet above the cavern floor, trapped in a hellish limbo. The relentless cascade of the waterfall drenched him in frigid, bone-chilling water. Every second that passed felt like an eternity. His breathing was ragged, his movements jerky and desperate. Above him, Chris and Anthony strained to see through the mist. Chris shouted words of encouragements, though he wasn't sure Hal could even hear him over the deafening roar of water. Hal's arms ached from gripping the ascenders, his muscles screaming in protest. He fumbled with his gear, trying to re-rig it for a descent. His hands were numb, the cold leaching all strength and precision from his fingers. His teeth chattered uncontrollably. From above, his friends watched in growing horror. Chris leaned dangerously close to the edge, gripping the rope as if he could somehow will Hal to climb higher. Anthony paced frantically, torn between the desire to descend and the grim reality that any attempt to do so might worsen the situation. The water was relentless. It poured down over him, battering his face, filling his nose and mouth with icy spray. His attempts to re-rig his gear became more frantic, but his hands were useless now, clumsy and shaking. Chris and Anthony could do nothing but watch, which haunted them. They finally made the decision. They exited the cave as quickly as possible, navigating the treacherous passages back to the surface. By 2:30 a.m., they reached Walker County 911, launching a full-scale rescue operation. The Georgia Department of Natural Resources, Walker County Cave Rescue, and other volunteer groups responded swiftly. Rescue teams, many of them experienced vertical cavers, began arriving at the scene in the early hours of Wednesday morning. The mission was clear: get Hal off the rope and out of the cave. Rescuers reached the lip of Incredible Pit by 9 a.m., nearly 9 hours after Hal's distress call. They rigged a hauling system with pulleys and ropes, preparing for the difficult task of lifting him out. One rescuer shouted into the pit, hoping back for a response from Hal. The only response was the unrelenting roar of the waterfall. Two rescuers descended cautiously. At the 150-foot mark, they found Hal. He was motionless, hanging limp in his harness. Hal's body was wedged in place by his equipment. His weight split between the tangled ropes. His head was slumped forward, his skin pale and cold. He had succumbed to hypothermia and positional asphyxia hours earlier, a victim of the relentless cold and the harness that had immobilized him. Carefully, the rescuers secured his body to the haul system. They worked methodically, knowing that any mistakes could jeopardize their own safety. Slowly, Hal's body was lifted out of the pit, emerging into the daylight late Wednesday evening. Hal's death marked the first fatality in Ellisons Cave and left a lasting impact on the caving community. More than 60 people participated in the rescue and recovery effort, with 35 entering the cave and others providing support on the surface. Despite their best efforts, Hal's life could not be saved. The discovery of the hidden cave was unplanned, a product of dynamite detonations at the Valley Stone Quarry near Staunton, Virginia, on July 26, 1967. To the workers, it seemed like a portal to an unknown world, a dark, yawning opening where no one had ventured. For 3 days, the newly exposed passage remained untouched. On the evening of July 29th, 4 quarry workers, Charles Vaught, 28, John Miller, 18, Johnny Branner, 24, and David Price, 21, decided to explore it. They weren't prepared for caving, carrying only flashlights and a rope, but excitement and curiosity overruled caution. For them, this was an adventure, a break from the routine grind of quarry life. As they descended into the cave, the air felt stagnant but bearable. The first few steps were tentative, the walls rough from the blast. The group moved deeper, the world outside fading with every step. Their voices, once lively and filled with laughter, became subdued as the atmosphere grew heavier. 70 feet in, the change was undeniable. The air became oppressively still, clinging to their skin like a damp veil. Breathing grew labored, their chests rising and falling faster. But the connection between the air and their growing unease was not immediately clear. The passage narrowed, the ceiling pressing closer, the walls leaning in. Each step seemed to draw more effort than the last. Then came the first wave of nausea, a creeping sickness that gripped their stomachs and sent a ripple of unease through the group. David was the first to pause, placing a hand against the wall to steady himself. It wasn't fatigue or fear that stopped him. It was something more primal, an instinctual alarm triggered by the unseen danger around them. As the group continued, their movements slowed. Johnny noticed it next, his head spinning as he reached out to steady himself. The air carried a faint metallic tang, subtle but persistent, like a warning they were too inexperienced to heed. Charles, leading the group, paused to survey the narrow passage ahead. His breathing was shallow, his movements unsteady. But he dismissed the unease as nerves. When the realization came, it hit all at once. Their breaths were quick and shallow now, not from exertion, but from the air itself. Panic set in. The group turned to retreat, their flashlight beams jittering wildly across the walls. Johnny and David moved quickly, their survival instincts kicking in. Behind them, Charles and John faltered. Charles stumbled first, his legs buckling as he tried to steady himself against the wall. His flashlight fell. John, still just a teenager, turned to help, but was overcome by the same suffocating wave. He dropped to his knees, his breaths coming in short, desperate gasps before he, too, collapsed. Johnny and David clung to the last vestiges of their strength as they stumbled toward the faint light of the cave's entrance. Johnny focused on the faint light ahead, a fragile beacon of hope, while David clung to his fading strength, each step driven by the sheer will to survive. They didn't dare look back, knowing only escape lay between them and the air they so desperately needed. They finally burst into the open air, collapsing near the quarry entrance. Their lungs heaved, pulling in the fresh, life-saving oxygen. The look in their eyes spoke volumes, a mix of terror and disbelief. Inside that cave, death had come for their companions, silent and unseen. After getting hold of their senses, they promptly contacted the emergency services. Rescue efforts began immediately. Among the first to respond was Melville Fitzgerald, a seasoned member of the Staunton Rescue Squad. Melville had seen many emergencies in his career, but the reports of foul air gave him pause. Toxic gases left behind by the quarry blast, likely carbon monoxide, were the suspected culprits. Despite the risks, Melville entered the cave, armed with nothing but a flashlight and a rope. The cave greeted him with a chilling silence, broken only by the crunch of his boots against the gravel floor. Each step deeper into the passage was a fight against the oppressive air. By the time he reached the room where Charles and John lay, his head was spinning and his chest burned with every breath. Charles's chest still rose faintly, a sign of life clinging to the brink. Melville dropped to his knees, reaching for him, but his own strength was failing. The air felt like a vice, tightening with every second. He had no choice but to retreat, his vision tunneling as he staggered back toward the entrance. Melville emerged from the cave barely conscious, collapsing into the arms of his team. His report was grim. One man might still be alive, but the toxic air was too dangerous to allow further attempts without proper ventilation. Industrial fans were brought in to ventilate the cave, pushing out the poisonous gases that had lingered for days. It was a painstaking process, and hours passed before conditions were deemed safe enough to retrieve the bodies. By the time rescuers returned for Charles and John, it was clear neither had survived. The autopsies confirmed what everyone feared. Both men had succumbed to carbon monoxide poisoning, their lungs robbed of oxygen in the silent darkness. Charles had been alive when Melville found him, but the gases had claimed him shortly after. The quarry supervisor later revealed that he had warned the men about the dangers of entering the cave. He had suspected that toxic gases from the dynamite blast might linger, trapped by the cave's poor ventilation. His warnings, however, had been ignored or downplayed. The cave itself was sealed shortly after, left as a tomb to the lives it had claimed and a silent witness to the tragedy. For Johnny and David, the survivors, the memory of those suffocating depths would never fade. They had escaped the cave, but the guilt of leaving their friends behind lingered like the toxic air that had nearly claimed them as well. On 25th February, 1967, two friends, Ralph Bucca and John Locke, ventured into Overhal Blowing Cave in the afternoon, undeterred by the biting cold that gnawed at their exposed skin. Their layers of clothing, a combination of long-sleeve shirts, jackets, and outer suits, were intended to shield them from the harsh conditions. Before entering Overhal Blowing Cave, Ralph and John had a brief chat with the owner, G. Dallas McKeever, who cautioned them about the hazards. He spoke plainly. The cave's frigid waters and freezing temperatures were relentless, especially during midwinter. McKeever didn't forbid their entry, but strongly advised against it, emphasizing how quickly cold and exhaustion could set in. Despite his warnings, Ralph and John felt confident. They had insulated clothing and considered themselves prepared. The seriousness of McKeever's tone barely registered. To them, the cave was another challenge to overcome, not the potential trap he described. Brushing aside his concerns, they believed they could handle whatever lay ahead, a belief that would soon unravel inside the unforgiving depths. But as they descended into the cave, its icy grip grew inescapable. The cave was a place of extremes, its frigid waters and damp air conspiring to test their resolve. The pair navigated the initial passages with relative ease, their headlights casting wavering beams on the wet, glistening walls. The air was dense, the silence broken only by their breathing and the occasional splash of water beneath their boots. They reached the infamous Dardanelles Passage about 30 minutes into their exploration. This stretch, a 500-foot-long crawl through freezing water, was notorious for its challenges, even under favorable conditions. As they began the crawl, Ralph immediately felt the cold water biting into him like needles, soaking through his layers and seeping into every pore. The water was relentless, clinging to their skin and drawing away what little warmth their bodies produced. Each forward movement was an effort of will, their limbs screaming against the numbing chill. John, ahead of Ralph, moved with deliberate caution, calling back occasionally to ensure his partner was close behind. By the time they emerged into the mountain room, Ralph's condition had begun to deteriorate. He flexed his fingers, attempting to restore sensation, but the numbness remained. His hands felt like blocks of ice, his legs stiff and unresponsive. "We should turn back," John suggested, noticing Ralph's slow movements and labored breathing. Ralph nodded reluctantly, his pride giving way to the grim reality of their situation. The return journey quickly became an ordeal. The Dardanelles Passage, so challenging on the way in, now felt insurmountable. The freezing water seemed colder, the crawl spaces tighter. Ralph's body was succumbing to the effects of hypothermia, his strength draining with every inch he advanced. His movements grew sluggish, his breath shallow and rapid. When they reached the halfway point, Ralph collapsed onto the wet ground, his hands trembling uncontrollably. John knelt beside him, panic rising in his chest. "Come on, Ralph, we're almost there," he urged, pulling Ralph up. But Ralph's body refused to cooperate. His legs buckled, and he slumped back into the icy water. The cave, once a place of curiosity and adventure, had become an unrelenting enemy. John realized he had to act quickly. Dragging Ralph's limp body through the tight crawl spaces was a grueling task. His own strength was waning, his muscles screaming in protest as he heaved Ralph forward inch by inch. The cold was a relentless thief, stealing away their energy and willpower. Ralph's head lolled to the side, his face pale and his lips tinged blue. His eyes fluttered closed, and for a terrifying moment, John thought he had stopped breathing. "Stay with me, Ralph," John muttered, his voice trembling. He shook Ralph gently, eliciting a faint groan. It was enough to spur him on. John pushed through the last stretch of the Dardanelles, every movement a battle against the cave's icy grip. By the time they emerged into the main passage leading to the entrance, John's hands were raw, his body trembling uncontrollably. But Ralph was slipping further away. His skin was ashen, his breath coming in shallow gasps. His body was stiff and unresponsive, a clear sign of advanced hypothermia. John knew time was running out. He half-dragged, half-carried Ralph through the final stretch, the faint light of the entrance barely visible through the darkness. As they stumbled out into the freezing night, John's lungs burned with the effort. He laid Ralph down in the nearby shed, frantically stripping off his wet clothes and replacing them with dry ones. The stove inside the shed offered a faint glimmer of warmth, but it wasn't enough. Ralph's body remained cold, his pulse weak and erratic. John rubbed Ralph's limbs, trying to restore circulation, but the lack of response was terrifying. John realized he couldn't do this alone. He sprinted to find McKeever, who quickly joined him in the shed. Together, they carried Ralph to the house, their desperation mirrored in the urgency of their movements. Inside, they worked tirelessly to revive him. McKeever boiled water for hot compresses, while John continued to rub Ralph's limbs, fighting against the clock. Ralph's breath grew fainter, his body teetering on the edge of life and death. It took another 2 hours before Ralph regained full consciousness, his body finally beginning to recover from the brutal ordeal. Ralph was minutes away from death, saved only by John's determination and the relentless efforts to warm him. The cave had pushed them to their limits, a stark reminder of the unyielding power of nature and the razor-thin line between survival and tragedy. For Ralph, the experience was a humbling lesson in respect for the elements. For John, it was a testament to the strength of the human spirit and the lengths one would go to save a friend. Known as the Mount Everest of cave diving, Eagle's Nest in Florida has claimed the lives of many who underestimated its risks. On November 3, 2010, 2 experienced open-water divers, James Woodall and Gregory Snowden, ventured into its depths. Without cave diving certifications, the pair underestimated the complexities of this infamous site, a fatal miscalculation. James and Gregory were experienced open-water divers, but had no cave diving certifications, a critical gap in their training. They had come to Florida for the annual Diving Equipment and Marketing Association show in Orlando, and Eagle's Nest was an irresistible challenge. Despite its reputation for claiming even skilled cave divers, the pair believed their rebreathers and technical diving experience would suffice. Their dive plan took them into the heart of the cave, roughly 1,000 feet or 305 meters, to a point known as the Super Room, a vast, echoing chamber deep within the system. They descended to a depth of 270 feet or 82 meters, far beyond recreational diving limits. Equipped with rebreathers running on an 18/30 gas mix, 18% oxygen, 30% helium, and the rest nitrogen, they moved cautiously through the flooded corridors. Their progress was slow but steady, the beams of their dive lights cutting through the inky blackness. The problems began on their return. While they had navigated to the Super Room without issue, the stress of the environment began to take its toll on their bodies and equipment. At such depths, the human body is vulnerable to a host of physiological dangers. Nitrogen narcosis, often called the Martini effect, impairs judgment and coordination, while oxygen toxicity can trigger seizures or unconsciousness. Compounding these risks, rebreathers rely on chemical scrubbers to remove carbon dioxide, a system that can fail without warning. As they swam back toward the entrance, James began to show signs of distress. In the Super Room, he became agitated, gesturing to his equipment. Gregory noticed that his friend's breathing appeared labored, and his movements were becoming erratic. James was suffering from a combination of nitrogen narcosis and oxygen toxicity. It seemed his rebreather's scrubber had stopped effectively removing carbon dioxide, a potentially lethal failure. Roughly 500 feet, 152 meters from the entrance, James's condition worsened. He struggled to maintain buoyancy, sinking slightly with each kick. Gregory acted quickly, offering his bailout gas 3 separate times. a secondary system that would bypass the malfunctioning rebreather. But James refused each offer, likely too impaired to make rational decisions. Then, the unthinkable happened. James lost consciousness and sank to the bottom of the passage, his lifeless body drifting downward in the dim glow of their dive lights. Gregory was faced with an impossible choice. His partner was a large man, and towing him through the tight, winding corridors of Eagle's Nest would be physically impossible without a diving scooter or additional help. Gregory was running out of time and gas himself. In one of the most harrowing moments of his life, Gregory had to abandon his friend to save his own life. With no other option, he continued his ascent toward the surface, carrying the weight of his failure to rescue James. When Gregory surfaced, he was alone. His breathing was ragged, his rebreather nearly depleted, and his hands trembling as he pulled himself out of the water. The weight of the dive bore down on him, not just the physical exhaustion, but the devastating realization that James was still down there, somewhere in the cold, dark depths of Eagle's Nest. He immediately called emergency services, explaining what had happened. It took hours for a specialized recovery team to arrive. These were experienced cave divers trained to navigate the deadly cave where Gregory and James had ventured. Gregory briefed them as best as he could, describing the super room, the final moments of James's struggle, and the exact spot where his friend had gone still and sunk into the shadows. The recovery team entered the water. The first diver descended, following the breadcrumb trail of guidelines Gregory and James had laid during their ill-fated dive. At 270 feet or 82 meters, the diver reached the spot Gregory had described. The beams of their lights pierced the darkness, and there, resting on the cave floor, was James. He was motionless, his rebreather still in place. James's position suggested he had passed out and drifted down without resistance, a haunting image that conveyed the finality of his struggle. The team worked methodically, securing James's body and beginning the painstaking process of bringing him back to the surface. When they emerged hours later, the recovery team was greeted by an ashen-faced Gregory, who had waited in silence. His expression told them he already knew what they would say. There was no need for words. Eagle's Nest had claimed another life. Investigations revealed that the dive had violated two key rules of cave diving. Neither diver had proper cave training, and their gas mix was unsuitable for the depth. The 18% oxygen content increased the risk of oxygen toxicity, while the 30% helium was insufficient to counteract the effects of nitrogen narcosis at such depths. These miscalculations, combined with the complexity of Eagle's Nest, sealed James's fate. On February 22, 1975, the skies above Bloomington, Indiana, were heavy with rain. The downpour had persisted for days, saturating the land and swelling rivers and streams across the region. During this, 3 university freshmen, Kim Aldrich, Marcia Bott, and Terry Yoakum, ventured into Salamander Cave, an underground labyrinth popular with novice cavers. For Aldrich, who had some caving experience, it seemed like an exciting way to spend the afternoon. For Bott and Yoakum, it was their first real taste of exploration. None of them carried adequate gear for the conditions they would soon face. Their journey began shortly after 1 p.m., but the rain-soaked cave would turn this outing into a deadly ordeal. Salamander Cave's charm lay in its accessibility, a feature that often lulled visitors into a false sense of security. However, heavy rains had transformed it into a potential death trap. The usually calm stream that wound its way through the cave was now a surging torrent. The group, undeterred by the rain, entered with only basic equipment: hard hats with carbide lamps for Aldrich and Yoakum, and a simple flashlight for Bott. They had no ropes, no waterproof gear, and no knowledge of how quickly a cave could flood under such conditions. As they stepped into the cave, they were met by John Abney, an experienced caver leading his group out. Abney had already seen the water levels rising dangerously and urged the students to turn back. His warning was clear: the cave was unsafe. Yet the 3 freshmen dismissed his advice, confident they could handle whatever lay ahead. Not long after, another warning came from Kathy Hoey, a graduate student conducting research in Salamander Cave. She had entered earlier in the day to study aquatic life, but had decided to leave when water levels reached her boots. Hoey not only left, but warned another group at the entrance who wisely chose to abandon their plans. Despite multiple warnings from experienced cavers, Aldrich, Bott, and Yoakum pressed on, eager to explore. Their decision to continue was rooted in inexperience and overconfidence. Aldrich, the group's leader, had explored caves before, but was far from an expert. Neither Bot nor Yoakum had any real caving experience, and none of them were prepared for the rapidly changing environment within Salamander Cave. As the trio moved deeper into the cave, the rain outside intensified. The cave's passages, once dry and navigable, began filling with water at an alarming rate. The stream inside, now a raging torrent, transformed familiar paths into a maze of danger. What might have seemed like manageable terrain during their initial descent became increasingly hostile. By 8:15 p.m., the situation outside had grown dire. Family and friends became more concerned and contacted people about their whereabouts. In some time, it was apparent that they were trapped inside the cave. With urgency, they reached out to the authorities for help. Michael Moore and Jim Keith, experienced cavers called by Indiana State Police, arrived to assess the cave's condition. What they found was sobering. Only 18 inches of airspace remained at the entrance passage. The water was rising steadily, leaving little hope for anyone trapped inside. The rescue team understood the urgency, but faced enormous challenges navigating the submerged tunnels. Inside the cave, the signs of the students' struggle became apparent. Muddy footprints marked their desperate attempts to find higher ground. Scratches on the cave walls suggested they had clung to the slick surfaces, fighting against the rising floodwaters. A carbide lamp lay abandoned, its light barely flickering. Even a half-eaten snack left on a ledge hinted at a fleeting moment of rest, where the trio may have tried to regroup before pressing on. The next morning, rescue efforts resumed. The water had receded slightly, allowing searchers to enter the cave. Less than 100 feet from the entrance, they found the bodies of Kim Aldrich and Marcia Bott. Both had drowned, overwhelmed by the surging floodwaters. Their bodies lay in the narrow entrance passage, where the airspace had all but disappeared. Terry Yoakum was still missing, and rescuers hoped he had managed to find shelter in a higher chamber. About 500 feet from the entrance was Breakdown Mountain, a massive 30-foot-high passage known as a potential refuge during floods. If Yoakum had made it past the narrow, water-filled passages leading to this area, he might have survived. However, their hopes were dashed. Yoakum's body was discovered not far from his friends, suggesting he too had been unable to escape the relentless rise of the floodwaters. Evidence indicated that the group had likely tried to press on, but had been overtaken by the water in one of the cave's tighter sections. In some places, only an inch of airspace remained, far too little for survival. Post-mortem analysis revealed that a combination of factors led to the disaster. The students lacked the equipment and training necessary for caving in such dangerous conditions. They ignored multiple warnings from experienced individuals, and, as the water levels rose, panic likely overtook them. Instead of retreating to higher ground within the cave, they attempted to escape through the increasingly treacherous entrance passage, a decision that proved fatal. It was a crisp morning on February 23, 1984. The sun had barely risen over Maui, Hawaii, when a group of divers boarded Ed Robinson's dive boat. These tourists, brimming with excitement, were about to embark on a diving expedition that none of them realized would end in disaster. John Baird, Tom Colin, Masao Nakan, and Preston Penny, all certified open-water divers, trusted their guides, Robinson and his assistant Sue, to navigate the treacherous underwater world awaiting them. Yet, beneath the calm waters near Cape Kinau lay a cave system, alluring but fraught with dangers they were woefully unprepared for. Their destination was a cavernous maze carved into the seabed, known for its stunning underwater chambers. But it was also notorious for its silty floors and narrow passages, hazards that would soon turn their dive into a frantic struggle for survival. The divers reviewed the plan aboard the boat. It was straightforward enough, or so it seemed. Robinson would lead the group, armed with a video camera to capture their adventure. Sue would act as the safety diver, staying at the rear. Each diver was issued a single flashlight, and a critical rule was laid out. An air check would occur at the midpoint. If anyone's air supply dropped below 1,500 psi, they would return immediately. With this briefing, the group plunged into the crystal-clear waters and descended toward the Cape Kinau Cave. The cave's main passage was vast at its entrance, wide enough for 6 divers to swim side by side. But as they ventured further, the space constricted. Sunlight faded, leaving only the beams of their flashlights to pierce the darkness. Things went smoothly, which is why they never laid out the guideline as they moved deeper. Perhaps subconsciously they had forgotten that what seems apparently fine in the underworld is only a ploy to a disaster that could strike any time. The cave's layout, while seemingly simple, was deceptive. A narrow restriction led from the main trunk to the deep chamber. It was in this chamber, at a depth of nearly 100 feet, that the serenity of their dive began to unravel. Tom Colin glanced at his pressure gauge and felt a jolt of anxiety. His air supply had plummeted to 600 psi, dangerously low for a cave dive. He signaled to Robinson, who began to guide him toward an exit. But Colin wasn't alone in his predicament. John Baird checked his own gauge and realized he too was on borrowed time. Visibility, already poor, was rapidly deteriorating as silt from the cave floor clouded the water. Robinson led both men out through a third entrance, but the exit was anything but smooth. As Colin's air supply dwindled to nothing, his sonic alarm shrieked in the eerie silence. Robinson shared his air, a life-saving gesture, but at the surface, the grim reality set in. Only Baird still had air left, a mere 100 psi. Meanwhile, chaos was brewing in the deep chamber. The visibility had degraded to near zero. The silt stirred by their movements created a suffocating cloud, and even the beams of their flashlights could barely cut through the darkness. Sue signaled to the remaining divers, Masao Nakan and Preston Penny, to exit the chamber immediately. Nakan fought his way through the tight restriction, emerging into the main trunk, but Preston struggled. The narrow passage seemed to close around him as he pushed forward, hindered by the swirling silt. Sue had to physically push him through, both of them finally making it out of the chamber. Nakan and Sue swam toward the middle exit. The relief of escaping the silty chaos was palpable. But then, as they surfaced, Sue scanned the group. Something was wrong. Preston was missing. A creeping dread settled over the group. Preston had been there just moments ago. His flashlight beam was just right there when they were getting out. Where was he now? They knew something down there went horribly wrong. Time was running out. Robinson acted swiftly. Grabbing an extra air cylinder, he re-entered the cave. The silence was deafening as he retraced their route through the passages. The silt had settled slightly, revealing fragments of the chaotic scene left behind. Then, in the dim glow of his flashlight, Robinson saw him. Preston lay motionless on the cavern floor, his camera in one hand, his flashlight in the other. His gear appeared intact, but his air cylinder was completely empty. The sight was chilling, not for its violence, but for its stillness. Preston had simply run out of air, his body succumbing in silence. Robinson brought him to the surface, but the outcome was inevitable. Efforts to revive him were futile. Preston was gone. The tragedy was complete. The aftermath was marked by somber reflection and harsh critique. Preston's death was preventable, a culmination of critical oversights and poor preparation. None of the divers had formal cave diving training. There was no guideline to navigate the passages. The group had failed to adhere to the 2/3 air rule, a standard that ensures enough air to exit a cave. At the midpoint air check, at least half the group had already reached unsafe limits. The dive had been reckless from the start, an accident waiting to happen, as experts would later describe it. For those who survived, the memories of that dive would never fade. The Cape Quo Cave, once a symbol of underwater wonder, became a grim reminder of nature's unforgiving power. As the diving community analyzed the tragedy, the warnings were clear. Caves demand respect and preparation. Dive with a plan, or risk never surfacing again. It was August 19th, 2007. The morning was calm, the air heavy with the promise of adventure, as Matthew Lund stirred from his tent at the campsite near Dogwood Spring in Florida. The 20-year-old was a seasoned free diver, his confidence built on countless excursions into the spring. Matthew loved freediving and had been practicing extreme snorkeling, a risky activity where he held his breath while diving deep without scuba gear. He had explored Dogwood Spring many times before, pushing the boundaries of his limits. He prepared quietly, careful not to wake his girlfriend, who was still fast asleep in their shared tent. Matthew's gear was simple yet essential: a mask, a snorkel, a swimsuit, and a small headlamp affixed to his mask. Without a word, he left the campsite and to the spring. Today was yet another day where he was ready to go beyond his limits. After reaching the spring, Matthew took a deep breath, the kind he had practiced so many times, and began his descent into the cave. The dark underwater world was familiar to him. Using his headlamp to guide the way, he swam deeper into the cave's passages straight down below. He had done this dozens of times, but extreme snorkeling always carried risks. With each kick of his fins, he descended further. But the underwater environment is unpredictable. It demands respect and can turn on even the most experienced divers in an instant. As Matthew navigated the narrow passageways of the cave, the sense of adventure was soon replaced by a growing awareness of the challenges ahead. At some point, something went terribly wrong. Perhaps it was a miscalculation or an unexpected turn in the cave. While either descending further or during his return, his head hit a rock. It was a sharp blow to his head, evidenced later by a gash which had left him dazed. Disoriented and running out of air, Matthew struggled to find his way back. Alone in the darkness, his confidence gave way to a desperate fight for survival, with his air running out and his sense of direction lost. Back at the campsite, the morning unfolded quietly at first. Matthew's girlfriend woke to find the tent empty. At first, she thought nothing of it. Matthew often went for early dives, but as minutes turned to hours, her unease grew. She checked the area, but couldn't find him. When she discovered that his car was still parked near the spring and there was no sign of him, panic set in. She alerted authorities, and soon, rescue teams were on the scene. Emergency responders arrived at Dogwood Spring, assessing the situation quickly. They located Matthew's car parked near the water. Divers specializing in underwater rescues were called in. Each moment felt like an eternity as they prepared their equipment, knowing time was critical. The rescue team entered the water, their flashlights cutting through the murky depths. The spring's entrance was beautiful but deceiving. Beneath the surface lay a maze of dark, narrow caves, and Matthew could be anywhere. The divers moved methodically, carefully following paths where they believed Matthew might have ventured. They tried methods to get something, any sound, but there was no response. Minutes turned into an hour as the search continued. The divers encountered jagged rocks and areas where the visibility dropped to almost nothing, making navigation even more treacherous. Despite their extensive experience, the conditions were a sobering reminder of the risks they faced. Finally, around 8:15 a.m., they found him. Matthew's body was a few feet near the entrance of the cave, hidden in a rubble of settled rocks. His headlamp was still attached to his mask. The gash on his head suggested he had struck the rock at some point, a likely cause of his disorientation. The rescuers signaled to each other and carefully retrieved him, handling his body with solemn precision. Bringing him to the surface was an emotionally heavy task, knowing the outcome would shatter the hopes of those waiting above. As soon as they brought Matthew's body to the surface, his girlfriend was overcome with shock. Just hours earlier, they had shared laughter and tender moments at the campsite, completely unaware it would be their last time together. The weight of the tragedy hit her all at once. She collapsed to the ground, tears streaming down her face, clutching Matthew's lifeless body, as if her love alone could bring him back. Matthew's death sent shockwaves through his circle of friends and family. His friends later shared that he had dived at Dogwood Spring countless times before, often pushing himself to explore deeper and longer. This wasn't reckless bravado, yet even the most skilled divers are not immune to the risks inherent in such extreme activities. On the 25th of May, 1970, in the rolling hills of Pennsylvania, 3 young cavers, Tom O'Halloran, 18, O'Neill Orsby, 24, and Del Mays, 20, set out to explore Big Ridge Cave. What was meant to be an adventurous day underground soon spiraled into a race against time, forcing the trio to face not just the cave's treacherous passages, but their own limits of endurance and survival. Big Ridge Cave, known for its narrow passageways and damp, unstable rock formations. But to the 3 young explorers, the thrill of descending into the deep was a test of courage, a rite of passage for those keen to unravel the secrets hidden beneath the Earth's surface. Tom, a relative newcomer to the world of caving, had only been involved in the activity for a few months. This was his first major expedition, and he was eager to prove his mettle. O'Neill, a seasoned caver, had been on countless trips like this, and Del, equally experienced, was both a guide and a friend to the group. The adventure began as the 3 descended into the cave's dark mouth. The sound of their footfalls echoed off the rock walls as they made their way toward the first obstacle, the stream passage. It was here, in the darkness and dampness of the cave, that their troubles would begin. The cave's path was winding, with steep inclines and drops that required the use of rappelling gear. As they approached a particularly treacherous section of the cave, Tom began to feel a sense of unease. The air was thick with humidity, and his breath came in quick bursts as he focused on securing his ropes. They reached a narrow fissure that sloped down into a deep drop. O'Neill had gone ahead, signaling to Tom and Dell to follow. Dell was next in line, carefully testing each foothold before proceeding. Tom, however, had trouble keeping his footing on the slippery surface. The moisture in the air and the mud-covered rocks made it nearly impossible to maintain a steady grip. As he descended the fissure, his foot slipped. The cave, which had been quiet except for the occasional drip of water from the stalactites, suddenly seemed to come alive with a terrifying noise as Tom slid uncontrollably down the rock face. His body, in an attempt to regain control, crashed against the jagged walls. He slid, helpless, over 8 feet down. The speed of his fall was alarming, and in an instant, his knee collided with a rock outcrop. A sharp, agonizing pain shot up his leg, and he felt his body slam into the bottom with a sickening thud. The panic set in immediately. Tom could feel the blood rushing to his head as the adrenaline surged through his veins. His knee throbbed with intense pain, and his vision blurred. He gasped for air, struggling to comprehend what had just happened. Dell, who was a few feet behind him, heard the crash and immediately turned, his heart racing in his chest. Dell shouted, his voice echoing through the narrow passage. Tom managed a weak groan, his hand clutching his knee. His knee was bleeding heavily, and a quick look at it confirmed the severity of the injury. What he had initially thought was a simple bruise turned out to be a deep gash, exposing the muscle beneath. O'Neill, hearing the commotion from the front, hurried back toward Tom. When he saw the injury, his expression darkened with concern. He quickly knelt beside Tom, assessing the situation. The cut on Tom's knee was worse than they had anticipated. It was deep, running along the side of his kneecap, and the blood was pooling around it, making the situation more urgent. Panic began to set in among the group, but O'Neill, staying calm under pressure, knew they had to act fast. "We need to get you out of here," O'Neill said, his voice steady despite the mounting urgency. Dell nodded in agreement, already preparing the ropes for an ascent. The group quickly realized that it was not only the injury to Tom's knee that they had to contend with. They were also in a difficult spot, far from the entrance and with no easy route to the surface. The thought of an emergency rescue crossed their minds, but the cave's narrow passages and the sheer distance to the surface made that an unlikely option. O'Neill instructed Dell to set up a belay system. They would need to hoist Tom out, but the tight space meant that each movement had to be deliberate. Dell worked quickly, securing the ropes and making sure everything was in place. Tom, now pale from the pain and loss of blood, could barely hold his composure. Every movement of his leg sent waves of excruciating pain through his body, and he fought the urge to scream. The team worked together, with Dell anchoring the ropes while O'Neill and Tom moved slowly, trying to relieve the pressure on the injured knee. The ascent began. Tom's body jerked with each pull, his weight making it difficult for the others to lift him. As they moved upward, every inch felt like a battle against gravity, but the team was determined. Minutes turned into what felt like hours as they finally reached the top of the drop. The strain on their muscles was unbearable, but they had to keep moving. By the time they had reached the top of the first drop, Tom was exhausted. His breathing was ragged, his knee still bleeding, but there was a sense of relief. They were nearly out of the cave. However, this was not over. They still had to ascend several more levels before reaching the surface. As the team made their way through the cave, Tom's condition deteriorated further. His body shook from the cold, and the blood loss left him weak and disoriented. O'Neill and Dell kept him moving, one step at a time. Finally, the group reached the cave's entrance. The sunlight pierced through the darkness as they emerged, bringing with it a momentary sense of relief. Tom was still in immense pain, but they had made it. Rescue teams were called, and Tom was rushed to the hospital. His knee required 8 stitches, and he was placed on a rigorous recovery plan. Despite the severity of the injury, he was fortunate, this time. His experience serves as a chilling reminder of the dangers that lurk beneath the surface, and how even the smallest misstep can change everything. The incident at Big Ridge Cave is a stark warning for anyone venturing into the dark depths of the earth. No matter how experienced, no one is immune to the perils that lie beneath. June 23, 2018. Nestled in the dense forests of western Massachusetts, a marble cave known as Convention Cave lies hidden beneath the Earth's surface. Its entrance, a modest opening in the hillside, offers little indication of the danger that can lurk within. The cave, discovered in 1979 during the National Speleological Society's annual convention in Pittsfield, stretches a mere 200 feet, but presents a formidable challenge for even the most experienced caver. Two friends, eager to explore this relatively remote part of the Berkshire Hills, found themselves caught in an unexpected and life-threatening situation. The first to enter was simply checking out the cave when something went terribly wrong. The two men approached the cave's entrance, a narrow opening that led into the depths of the earth. There was no sign that anything was amiss, just a quiet, seemingly innocent cave waiting to be explored. But the man, perhaps too eager or too distracted by the sheer wonder of the cave's mystery, leaned forward at the entrance. It was a simple motion, one that many would have made without a second thought. He shifted his weight, reaching to examine the opening more closely when, in a heartbeat, disaster struck. The ground beneath his feet, slick with a thin layer of moisture, gave way. His feet slipped out from under him, and before he could react, he pitched forward into the cave. In that single terrifying moment, everything changed. The man became wedged between two massive boulders deep within the cave, his head down, his body contorted in a way that made it impossible for him to move. The weight of the rock pressed on his chest, the narrow gap offering no room to maneuver, no chance for escape. It was a cruel twist of fate. One moment, he was simply stepping forward in search of adventure, and the next, he was helplessly trapped in the cold, unforgiving dark. His friend, witnessing the fall, immediately rushed to his aid. He called out, desperate for help, but the dense forest surrounding the cave offered no immediate assistance. The trapped man, his mind racing, tried to wiggle free, but the rocks were immovable. Every attempt to shift his body made the pressure on his chest worse. He could feel the bruises forming, and his breath became shallow as panic began to set in. His friend, now frantic, made his way back to the entrance, his heart pounding with the urgency of the situation. He knew they were in trouble of a scale that only those who have been trapped in the bowels of the earth can truly understand. He pulled out his phone, praying for a signal, but the thick stone and the dense canopy above offered little hope. Finally, a single bar of service. He called 911. The clock was ticking. The man, still wedged between the boulders, could feel the coldness of the cave seeping into his skin, his body already bruised and battered. His breathing grew more labored, the sensation of being trapped too overwhelming to ignore. As the fire department received the emergency call, the weight of the situation became clear. For the fire chief, this was an entirely new kind of challenge. In his 37 years of service, he had seen fires, accidents, and rescues of all kinds. But this was the first time he had ever been called to a cave rescue. His department had never been called upon to retrieve someone from the depths of a cave. This was uncharted territory. Yet, it wasn't the first time that Convention Cave had tested human endurance. In the early 1980s, it had made headlines when it was first described in the Northeastern Caver Journal. But, back then, no one had anticipated that it would become the site of such a terrifying real-life drama. Inside the cave, the trapped man continued to struggle against his confinement. His back was already showing signs of severe injury. His head had been grazed against the rocks during his fall, and the pain was unbearable. The blood from his lacerations soaked through his clothing, staining the ground beneath him. It felt as though time itself had come to a standstill. The dark, cold walls of the cave offered no comfort, no reprieve from the physical and mental torment of being trapped. His mind drifted to his family and friends, the people who loved him. Would they ever see him again? The thought of them haunted him as much as the crushing weight of the rocks. Back at the entrance, his friend was doing everything he could to remain calm, to keep talking to him, to offer any semblance of hope. But as the minutes turned to hours, the helplessness grew overwhelming. Finally, after what felt like centuries, the sound of the rescue team brought hope. But the situation was far from over. When the technical rescue team arrived at Convention Cave, the situation was clear. A man was wedged in a head-down position between two boulders near the entrance of the cave. His friend, who had stayed nearby to offer reassurance, explained the fall and pointed out the narrow crevice where his companion was trapped. The first step was a thorough assessment of the scene. The rescuers observed that the entrance area was damp and slippery, with tight confines that limited movement. Communication with the trapped man confirmed that he was conscious, but in significant pain. The team quickly set up a staging area near the entrance and organized their gear. A tripod system was erected above the cave entrance to provide a secure anchor point for rope operations. This setup allowed for both vertical extraction and controlled movement within the tight confines of the cave. The team quickly stabilized the area, inserting inflatable airbags into the crevice to widen the gap without destabilizing the rocks. Rescuers worked carefully to reduce pressure on the man's chest, applying padding to protect his injuries and administering oxygen to support his shallow breaths. Communication was constant to reassure the man and monitor his condition, while a custom harness was secured around his torso in the tight confines. With the harness in place, the team set up a pulley system anchored to a tripod above the cave entrance, allowing them to extract him in controlled, incremental movements. Each lift was coordinated with adjustments to the airbags to prevent the rocks from shifting dangerously. After nearly 2 hours of painstaking effort, the man was finally freed. Though exhausted and battered, he was alive. He had suffered deep lacerations to his back and head, but he had survived, thanks in no small part to the skill and determination of the rescue team. His friend, too, was relieved to see him free, though the emotional toll of the event would not be easy to shake. The rescue was a success, but it came at a cost. The harrowing hours of being trapped, the uncertainty of whether help would come in time, would stay with the man for the rest of his life. June 20th, 2015. It begins like many adventures do, with curiosity and a sense of wonder. But for Seth Rowe, what started as an exploration of nature's beauty soon spiraled into a life-or-death struggle, deep beneath the forest floor of Singhampton, Ontario. Seth Rowe, a 30-year-old outdoor enthusiast, had ventured into the conservation park with little more than a backpack, a headlamp, and an appetite for discovery. Seth had a secret plan: to explore the park's hidden crevice caves, a labyrinth of narrow passages carved by time and nature. He hadn't told anyone where he was going. This particular cave was unmarked and unnamed, a fissure barely wide enough for a human body. Seth's plan was straightforward: a quick look and back out. The entrance he found was barely visible, a narrow slit in the rocky ground, no more than 20 inches wide. It dropped steeply into the earth, narrowing further as it descended. Seth assessed the space. Confident in his ability, he switched on his headlamp and began to lower himself inside. In the world of caving, the temptation to push just a little farther is almost irresistible. But caves hold secrets and dangers that can quickly turn fascination into peril. The walls closed around him quickly, pressing on his shoulders as he moved deeper. At its narrowest, the passage was just 15 inches wide, forcing Seth to shift carefully with each step. He reached a point where the cave tightened further, leaving no room to continue. Suddenly, his progress halted. A section of rock jutted out just above him, blocking his path forward. Deciding it wasn't worth the risk to press on, Seth began to backtrack. But the cave had other plans. Bracing his foot against a small outcrop, Seth tried to hoist himself back toward the surface. The stone, worn by centuries of erosion, shifted under his weight. Before he could react, it crumbled away. He dropped like a stone. Seth plunged 36 feet into the darkness. The fall was sharp and disorienting, his body colliding with the jagged walls before coming to an abrupt stop. He was wedged in a narrow space, 18 feet from the entrance but far below the surface. Seth was alive, but his situation was grim. His arms and legs were scraped and bruised, and a shallow cut on his forehead bled steadily. He tried to move, but the crevice held him tightly. The pain was manageable, but the realization of his predicament was not. Alone, with no way to climb out, Seth began calling for help. The pain hit him in waves. His arms and legs throbbed with sharp, stinging sensations. The hours crawled by. Seth's cries for help echoed through the cave, swallowed by the earth above. He shouted until his throat burned, his voice fading into the suffocating silence. By evening, he began to lose hope. Alone in the dark, Seth felt the weight of his decisions pressing down on him. The thrill of exploration had turned into a waking nightmare. Hours passed. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the forest above grew cold and still. Then, a sound broke through the stillness. A distant rustling, faint but unmistakable. Above ground, two hikers were making their way back to the trailhead when they heard the faintest cries for help, a faint, desperate voice. They stopped, listening carefully, and followed the sound to the cave's entrance. Peering into the opening, they spotted a faint glow far below. Seth's voice reached them, weak but clear. He was trapped and couldn't move. The hikers immediately called emergency services. Rescue teams arrived quickly. Floodlights illuminated the area as first responders assessed the situation. Seth was wedged too far down for a simple extraction, and the narrow passage made accessing him a challenge. Rescuers lowered water, granola bars, and blankets to keep him hydrated and warm while they worked. Despite his exhaustion, Seth remained alert, clinging to their reassurances. The team faced a significant obstacle: the cave's width. Standard rescue techniques were impossible. As midnight approached, they brought in an air chisel to carve away the rock around Seth. The work was painstakingly slow, each strike of the chisel reverberating through the crevice. By dawn, Seth had been underground for nearly 20 hours. Rescuers continued chipping away at the rock, widening the space around him inch by inch. The cold and exhaustion were taking their toll on everyone involved, but the team pressed on. Finally, after 22 hours of effort, Seth was freed. He emerged pale and battered, but alive. Rescuers wrapped him in blankets and rushed him to an ambulance. Remarkably, his injuries were minor: cuts, bruises, and dehydration. The operation was a success, but it came at a cost. The rescue effort had cost more than $46,000, sparking discussions about the financial burden of such incidents. Seth, however, was left with a deeper understanding of the risks he had taken. He later admitted that entering the cave alone was a mistake. His experience became a cautionary tale for others drawn to the thrill of unexplored places. The cave remains as it was, a narrow, unforgiving fissure, silent once again. Seth's story stands as a stark reminder of the dangers that lie beneath the surface, where even the smallest mistake can become a fight for survival. On April 6, 1985, in the silent wilderness of Rockcastle County, Kentucky, three friends embarked on what they believed would be a routine caving expedition. They were experienced, confident, and curious, a combination that would lead them into the heart of a nightmare. The entrance to Up and Down Cave loomed before them, an unassuming crack in the earth that opened into the unknown. The group consisted of Christine Gerace, Jack Lewis, and Ben Harris. Their goal was a descent into a pit accessible only by a narrow 70-foot shaft, what cavers call a chimney. It was the kind of passage where mistakes were not forgiven. The trio moved swiftly as they prepared for the descent. Christine watched as Jack secured his harness and stepped over the edge, his rope sliding smoothly through the belay device as he disappeared into the blackness. Ben followed close behind. Alone at the top, Christine adjusted her gear, her movements steady and practiced. She clipped onto the rope and began her descent. The chimney walls pressed in close, rough and unyielding. The damp rock sapped warmth from her hands as she gripped the rope. Jack and Ben's voices echoed faintly from below, their words indistinct. Christine paused briefly to listen, then continued downward. The chimney grew narrower, forcing her to angle her body awkwardly. She moved carefully, calculating each step. Jack and Ben had already reached the bottom. They untied and moved deeper into the cave. "Let's check this lead," Jack muttered, his excitement building. Ben nodded in agreement. They didn't wait for Christine. She was experienced, and they assumed she'd catch up soon enough. Christine was halfway down the chimney when the trouble began. The walls constricted sharply, leaving barely enough room for her to move. She turned her body sideways to navigate the tight passage, her chest brushing against the rock. Then her foot slipped. Her body jolted violently. She came crashing down, trying to hold on to something. She kept on slipping deeper, slamming chest first into the narrowest part of the shaft. Pain exploded through her torso as a sickening crack rang out. Her ribs felt as if they'd been shattered, and a burning sensation spread across her chest. The pain was immediate, searing. Christine instinctively tried to move, but the rocks held her in place. Her ribs felt as if they had shattered. Every shallow breath sent sharp, electric shocks of pain coursing through her torso. She clawed at the walls, trying to push herself free, but her arms couldn't find any leverage. Her legs dangled uselessly below her, unable to touch anything solid. She kicked desperately, each movement sending more jolts of pain radiating through her body. Far below, Jack and Ben were oblivious. They crouched near a narrow opening, inspecting the next passage. Their voices were calm, excited, and completely unaware of Christine's distress. The thrill of discovery consumed them. Jack pointed his headlamp down the new lead, marveling at the sharp twists of the rock. "This looks promising," he said, motioning for Ben to follow. Neither man stopped to wonder why Christine hadn't arrived yet. Christine was trapped. Her body wedged against the unforgiving rock, her breathing shallow and labored. Panic clawed at her mind as she realized her calls for help had gone unanswered. She knew Jack and Ben were too far away to hear her. She tried to move, but the pain in her chest intensified. Her fractured ribs ground against one another with every attempt to free herself. Sweat poured down her face as her breaths became faster, more erratic. For a moment, she froze. She imagined the hours ticking by, her strength waning until she could no longer fight. The thought of dying here, alone in the suffocating darkness, ignited a wave of panic. "No," she thought, clenching her teeth against the pain. "Not like this." She forced herself to think clearly. Her pack was slung awkwardly over her shoulder, the strap dangling close to her hand. She grabbed it, her fingers trembling as she swung it toward a small rock projection just within reach. The strap missed. She tried again, gritting her teeth as her ribs screamed in protest. On the third attempt, the strap caught. With every ounce of strength she had left, Christine pulled herself upward. The movement was agonizing, each inch sending fresh waves of pain through her body. Finally, she freed herself from the choke point and then suddenly slipped through the narrow crevice, falling onto the cave floor. Exhausted and battered, she collapsed onto a narrow ledge. Jack and Ben were now deep in the cave, their focus fixed on the twisting passageways ahead. The excitement of discovery drowned out any thoughts of Christine's absence. Christine was moving again, but barely. She found Jack and Ben examining another lead. They turned to see her pale, sweat-drenched face. She didn't need to say anything. Her condition was obvious. Her breathing was shallow and labored, her movements sluggish. Jack and Ben exchanged a panicked glance, their earlier excitement evaporating. Jack moved quickly to support her, placing a steadying hand on her shoulder. Ben fumbled to grab a water bottle from his pack, holding it out with shaky hands. "You need to drink," he said, his eyes scanning her pale, sweat-soaked face. Christine nodded weakly, but barely had the strength to lift the bottle. Jack helped her take a sip, watching as she struggled to catch her breath. "We can't stay here," Jack said, his tone urgent. "She's in bad shape. We need to get her out, now." Ben nodded, already securing the gear they'd need for the ascent. Christine's legs buckled slightly as Jack and Ben helped her to her feet, each of them taking an arm to steady her. Every movement sent a grimace of pain across her face, her shallow, labored breathing a constant reminder of her condition. The journey back to the surface was excruciating. Christine's body trembled as she climbed the 70-foot chimney, her strength fading with each pull on the rope. Jack climbed just ahead of her, his hands ready to catch her if she faltered. Ben stayed below, shouting encouragement as she fought to keep going. When they finally emerged into the open air, Christine collapsed onto the ground, her body convulsed with exhaustion, her breath shallow and uneven. Jack and Ben rushed to her side, their faces pale with fear. They drove her to the nearest hospital, where the full extent of her injuries became clear. Several ribs were fractured, and her lungs had been dangerously close to collapse. In the aftermath, Christine's ordeal haunted the group. They had broken the most basic rule of caving: never leave anyone behind. Their excitement had blinded them to the dangers, and it had nearly cost Christine her life. For Christine, the memory of being trapped, of the crushing rock and the suffocating darkness, stayed with her forever. Up and Down Cave was no longer a place of discovery. It was a place of survival, a grim reminder of how close she had come to the edge. July 15, 2006. The Chassahowitzka River in Florida is a destination for adventurers seeking thrill and escape. On this humid summer night, 4 friends, eager to explore the depths, gathered for a daring experience that would turn into a nightmare. Their plan seemed simple: snorkeling and free diving into the smaller caves scattered throughout the river. They came prepared, or so they thought, with a single flashlight and basic snorkeling gear. It was a makeshift setup, far from the specialized equipment required for cave diving. Their youthful confidence masked an inexperience that would soon become painfully apparent. The clock edged past 3 a.m. as the group took turns diving into one of the river's uncharted caves. Each dive was brief, and the group relied on the flashlight to guide their path. The last to take his turn was Jason Boyette, a 22-year-old known among his friends for his adventurous spirit. Jason slipped into the water, the flashlight's beam slicing through the darkness. He descended steadily, using the flashlight to illuminate the way ahead as he swam deeper into the unknown. The entrance widened briefly before tightening into a suffocating passage, just 10 to 12 feet long and barely 2 feet in diameter. Jason had to maneuver through one of 3 smaller holes within the tunnel to progress. On the surface, his friends waited, peering into the water and tracing the path of his flashlight. Minutes passed. Jason didn't resurface. At first, they thought he might be taking his time or exploring further than the rest of them had dared. But as silence dragged on and the light grew faint, unease set in. One of Jason's friends, Tyler, decided to dive down in search of him. Equipped with only a mask and a desperate determination, Tyler plunged into the water and followed the faint beam of light. The cave walls seemed to close in with every foot he swam. He noticed that the glow of the flashlight that showed no signs of panic before flickers erratically now, no longer steady but going back and forth, signaling a struggle. Tyler's heart pounded as he pushed forward, the weight of the water and the pressure of the cave bearing down on him. As he neared the source of the light, he could see Jason. It was apparent that his body got stuck in the narrow crevice, his arms flailing as he tried to free himself from the hole that had trapped him. Since Jason was wedged tightly but was facing in Tyler's direction, it was evident that Jason had gotten too deep, and while turning back and exiting out, the narrow, daunting hole grabbed him in its death grip. Tyler reached out, but the passage was too narrow to navigate without gear. The sharp edges of the cave's opening threatened to trap him as well. Jason's eyes locked onto Tyler's for a moment. It was a look of panic and desperation, a silent plea for help. Tyler hesitated, torn between pushing forward and the knowledge that doing so could mean getting trapped himself. The inadequate equipment they had brought with them made any rescue attempt almost impossible. Tyler felt the crushing weight of his own limitations as the air in his lungs began to burn. He had no choice but to retreat. Breaking the surface, Tyler gasped for air, his mind racing. He shouted to the others, his voice trembling as he described what he had seen. "He's stuck," he choked out. "I saw him. He's trapped down there." The group erupted into chaos. They dove repeatedly, one after another, trying to find a way to reach Jason. Each attempt ended the same. The tunnel was too tight, the conditions too perilous. The flashlight's beam, once frantic with movement, grew dimmer each time they looked. Soon, it disappeared entirely. By 3:30 a.m., desperation turned to grim acceptance. They called for help, their voices breaking as they explained the situation to the authorities. Rescue divers from the local sheriff's office were dispatched immediately. When they arrived, the scene was tense and somber. The divers assessed the cave, but determined it was too dangerous to begin a recovery effort in the dark. They would have to wait until first light. As dawn broke over the river, the rescue operation began. The divers, equipped with specialized gear and years of experience, descended into the depths. They moved cautiously, the narrow confines of the cave requiring precision and calm. At 9 a.m., they found Jason's body. He was wedged in one of the smaller holes within the tunnel. His lifeless form was the consequence of the risk they took of exploring without proper preparation. The divers carefully extricated him, widening the crevice enough to get him out. Jason's death sent shockwaves through his circle of friends and the local community. For Jason's friends, the guilt and grief were overwhelming. They replayed the night in their minds, wondering if there was something, anything, they could have done differently. Tyler, in particular, struggled with the memory of those final moments. September 4th, 1967, was the second day of the expedition into the rugged Guadalupe Mountains for the 4 experienced vertical cavers: Richard Breisch, Douglas Evans, Ellsworth Rolfs, and Loren Bollinger. The group had spent the previous day inspecting a 60-foot pit, but today, their attention was focused on the challenging depths of Vanishing River Cave. With over a century of combined experience, the team knew the risks but approached their task with cautious optimism. The cave's 150-foot vertical drop and narrow passages demanded precision, and they came prepared with advanced rigging equipment, helmets, and a staggering 600 feet of rope. The environment was not as stable as it seemed. The mountainous landscape had been battered by weather fronts in recent weeks, leaving the ground around the cave's entrance soft and precarious. McClellan Ridge, where the cave entrance lay, was infamous for its unpredictable shifts in weather. Clear skies could transform into torrents within hours. Local reports had warned of a potential storm brewing, but it seemed distant, unlikely to interfere with the day's plans. By mid-afternoon, the team had successfully rigged the cave's entrance, carefully descending to its depths. At 150 feet below the surface, they explored the main chamber before moving to a secondary level approximately 100 feet up. The group worked seamlessly, each member attuned to the dangers inherent in vertical caving. Evans was the first to ascend back to the surface using Prusik knots, a technique requiring skill and endurance. The climb was steep and relentless, the walls of the cave narrowing as he approached the surface. As he emerged into daylight, a gust of wind carried the sharp scent of rain. Peering out over the surrounding terrain, he called down to his teammates, warning them that the weather was turning. His voice carried urgency, but the rest of the group, focused on packing their gear and coiling the rope, didn't immediately react. Below, Lauren, Richard, and Rolfs began to feel the cave tremble faintly as the wind outside intensified. Suddenly, the sound of falling debris shattered the cave's stillness. Rocks from the unstable entrance above began to clatter downward, dislodged by the worsening weather. Lauren glanced up in time to hear Evans shout, his voice cut short by the gut-wrenching sound of a body striking rock. The noise was unmistakable. It was the sound of flesh and bone meeting unyielding rock, followed by the heavy silence of realization. For a moment, none of them moved. Richard's hands froze mid-motion on the rope, and Rolfs, who had been kneeling on a ledge below, looked up, his face pale. It was Evans. There could be no doubt. After the impact, Evans fell nearly 50 feet, his body colliding with an outcropping on the 100-foot level before landing hard on the rocky floor. The impact echoed through the chamber, a brutal reminder of how quickly things could go wrong. Lauren and Rolfs rushed to his side, finding him conscious but in excruciating pain. Blood poured from deep lacerations on his head, staining his helmet, which lay cracked and useless. His breaths came in shallow gasps as he groaned, clutching his side. Rolfs, a trained Red Cross first aid instructor, worked quickly to stabilize him, but the situation was dire. Evans mumbled about intense back and pelvic pain, and his movements were restricted by his injuries. Meanwhile, Richard began the climb to the surface, determined to summon help. He threw down extra clothing to keep Evans warm before disappearing into the worsening storm. Above, rain lashed the mountainside, turning the ground to mud and threatening to flood the cave's entrance. Richard's climb was grueling, his hands and legs aching as he fought the rope, which now hung damp and heavy. Back in the cave, Lauren and Rolfs worked tirelessly to keep Evans alive. Rolfs monitored his breathing and pulse while Lauren ascended to the surface to light a signal fire, hoping to draw rescuers to their remote location. The hours dragged on, the air growing colder and wetter as the rain outside intensified. At 6:30 p.m., Evans's shallow breaths stopped entirely. Rolfs, exhausted but resolute, began CPR. Every chest compression felt like a battle against time, his hands shaking with effort. He alternated with rescue breaths, shouting encouragement to Evans as if sheer willpower could bring him back. Minutes turned into an hour, but Evans showed no signs of recovery. Finally, at 7:25 p.m., Rolfs, his energy and hope drained, ceased his efforts. Evans was gone. The tragedy weighed heavily on the team, but the worsening rain left no time for mourning. The situation was quickly becoming dangerous for every single one of them inside the cave. They had no option but to head for an escape, leaving their lifeless friend behind as the water was pouring inside from all directions. Fearing the cave might flood, Rolfs began his ascent, each pull on the rope a Herculean effort. When Lauren attempted his own climb shortly after, disaster struck again. 30 feet from the surface, his aging rope snapped, sending him swinging wildly into the cave wall. He landed hard, but managed to regain control, using his remaining strength to stabilize himself against the walls. Though shaken, Lauren quickly assessed the situation, realizing how precarious their position was, with the storm worsening and the ropes compromised. He quickly worked to secure a safer line and called for help, aware that every moment counted to prevent further disaster. Adrenaline surged as he scrambled to reattach himself to the safety line, his heart pounding as he fought to regain control. By sheer determination, he completed the climb, collapsing at the surface in the rain-soaked mud. They were safe, but their friend was still inside. Soon the weather and conditions inside the cave became even worse, making the body recovery operation impossible. The tragedy hit them all hard. They took shelter nearby and spent the entire night silent, grieving over their lost companion. The next morning, as the storm became weaker, they returned with a rescue team. It took hours to recover Evans's body, an effort further hampered by the remote location and treacherous conditions. The group finally reached a roadhead by midnight, their grief and exhaustion palpable. In the days that followed, the survivors reflected on the accident. Evans's fall had been caused by a perfect storm of factors: the funnel-shaped entrance to the cave, the unstable debris loosened by rain, and the absence of a backup safety line. It's a lesson about nature and the wilderness, and how people with more than 20 years of caving experience could find themselves at its mercy.